Exploring Santa Cruz, a bi-weekly program on KSQD 90.7 FM. I'm your host for today, Matilda Rand. My guests are Rick Hyman, Tom Bin, and Sarah Tinger. Our program will delve deep into the history of the Carmelita Cottages, where now the Santa Cruz Hostel is located on Main Street in Santa Cruz. Then we'll discuss the establishment of the Santa Cruz Hostel, its present operations, and the planned celebration of its 30th anniversary. Travelers from all over the world spend one or more days at the hostel while exploring Santa Cruz County. The cottages and the hostel have a fascinating history, and we will start with a tape presentation by Rick Hyman, who could not be here in person. Rick Hyman started collecting postcards as a young kid. As he accumulated old Santa Cruz cards, he grew more curious about our history, and like many of us, took Sandy Leiden's history class. He learned about the Carmelita Cottages as a result of this work at the California Coastal Commission, incidentally where he spent his entire career. Having some good friends in the Hostel Society, he decided his contribution to their project would be to research the history of the cottages. And today, he'll share the results.
First, I'm going to talk about the history of the land and the buildings. Then I'm going to talk about the history of the hostel, and then I'll tie the two together. And when we talk about the land, we acknowledge that the cottages sit on the unceded territory of the Owasso-speaking Yupi tribe. And long ago, up on Beach Hill, there was a Native American village called Olatok. Imagine you were up there hundreds, thousands of years ago. Of course, there's none of the buildings, the landscaping isn't there. You could look out and see the bay. And if you saw a dead sea mammal wash up on the beach, you knew it's time to take a short walk down the hill and get your groceries. So now moving on to more recent history, of course, the Native Americans were subjugated by the Spanish who governed, then the Mexicans governed, and then came the Americans. In the late 40s, when our little town first came up under American control, the city fathers, and of course they were men back then, they had Beach Hill divided up into square half-acre parcels, and they sold them off to make some money. So who would want to live up there? Well, imagine you're a sea captain. You often come into Santa Cruz, so you could anchor your boat right offshore, maybe take a little dinghy to the beach, short walk up the hill, and you'd be home. You could look out, you could see the ocean weather conditions, probably see your boat. Time to go back to work, short walk down the hill. So one of these sea captains was a Mexican war veteran named Timothy Herbert Dame. And after doing various land transactions, he bought part of one of these parcels, and he bought the single-story house that still stands today at 315 Main Street, part of the hostel, in 1872. Now picture, let's say you're a traveler, you're coming into Santa Cruz by boat, you might be thirsty, hungry, you need a place to stay. So just down at the foot of Main Street, where the Casablanca is today, there used to be a grand hotel called the Sea Beach Hotel. Maybe some listeners have seen pictures, but it actually grew from a much more modest structure called the Ocean View House at one point, and that was owned by saloon keeper Thomas Varley Johnson. And so just up the street, Johnson buys the parcel next to Dame's, and he builds the two-story house that still stands today at 321 Main Street, again in 1872. And maybe he did this in anticipation of getting married the next year to Mary Ann Hutchinson. Now, Mary Ann has a sister back in New York called Ellen, and unfortunately, she gets widowed at a fairly young age with a young daughter named Lottie. So Ellen brings Lottie to Santa Cruz to be with her sister. And for this next, again, have to use your imagination what might have transpired. But anyway, Ellen falls in love with the older, either widowed or divorced sea captain Dame, and marries him in 1881. Now, very interestingly, the day they go down to the courthouse to get married, they do a land transaction, and Ellen buys Dame's property from him for $1,000. Now, we can only speculate why. It might have had something to do with his poor financial condition, or maybe she wanted to make sure that his two sons didn't get the property and it stayed with her side of the family. Because that's what happened. He dies a few years later, and Ellen and Lottie continue to live on the property. And over time, Ellen gives her property to her daughter, Lottie. Similarly, next door, Mary Ann Johnson, over time, gives her property to her niece Lottie, so that by the time that Mary Ann dies in 1920, Lottie owns both these properties. Together, they're, again, like that original half-acre parcel. Now, let's go back in time a little before 1885, because there's a cottage that's built on Dame's property. And over the next 30 years, several other cottages are built on the property. They're built as rentals. They're all rented out. Early days to visitors. Later on, they become more permanent dwellings. And the first rental that I found was from 1887. Lottie manages these all. She calls it Carmelita Court until her death in 1955. And in her will, Lottie leaves her property to the city of Santa Cruz for the purpose of maintaining a public park to be cleared and landscaped, making it a restful place for the public to enjoy. But there's a couple caveats. For one, she gives a life estate to one of her current tenants, Abra Budworth. Abra lives another 21 years. So it's not until 1976 that the city gets the property. And by that time, those two front houses are both over 100 years old. And then the rest of the cottages, they're getting kind of old too, basically single wall construction. And let's just put it nicely, not in very good shape. But they're all lived in. And the tenants and their supporters make it abundantly clear to the city council they want to stay. They don't want their homes torn down. So what's the city do? They have a dilemma. On one hand, they could make a park like the will says, or they could continue to be a landlord basically for affordable housing. But there's another factor too, Stanford University, because another caveat in the will said, if the city didn't make the property a park, Stanford gets it. Stanford made it pretty clear to the city, they coveted that property. They said to the city, you better get it made a park pretty soon or it's ours. And there's one other complication. Some of the historic preservation people in town wanted to see the buildings preserved, and they were successful in getting the buildings put on the National Register of Historic Places. So now let's stop and we'll talk about the history of the origins of the hostel. And to start, I want to read what one of the early founding board members, Peter Pitot, wrote. He says, the hostel was started in the early 70s. At first, in one of the outback buildings of the county hospital. It was operated through USA Riptide. The overnight fee was 25 cents if you had it. Later, the hostel became an independent nonprofit and operated during the summer at the Mission Hill Junior High Gym. Many international visitors mulled around the entrance, waiting for the doors to open at 6 p.m. A volleyball stand supported a curtain of sheets that separated women only from the co-ed sleeping section, mattresses on the floor. There were plenty of showers. The only complaints were when the school forgot to turn on the boilers. A $10 refrigerator from Goodwill was so noisy, it had to be kept outside, unquote. So after that, the hostel operated a couple other places, but the board members wanted their own permanent location. So they looked all over. They were looking at Wilder Ranch, for example, and Natural Bridges. Now, around that time, I was familiar with the cottages from my work, and I had a really good friend on the hostel board, and I mentioned them to her. I said, maybe you ought to check them out. In all fairness, Peter told me he discovered them on his own. The important date is 1984, because that's when the city and the Hostel Society work out a lease agreement, whereby the city leases the property for $1 a year. In return, they promise to get the buildings fixed up and rent them out as low-cost accommodations to be within a city park. That's not the end of the story, however, because there were numerous obstacles to overcome dating back several years before then, and then several years after 1984. In addition to the complications with Stanford, the tenants, and historic preservation, there were lawsuits. The city actually took actions that went against the hostel. And then, of course, there are financial issues. Costs a lot of money to fix up old buildings. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to mention how one of those obstacles, the financing, was partly overcome. And for that, I want to quote another early board member, Peter Canvas. He says, Without the support and funding from the Coastal Conservancy, the Santa Cruz Hostel would not exist today. That funding can be traced to the efforts of Catherine Byers, City Council member, meeting with Coastal Conservancy staff Mark Baylor at the Carmelita Cottages shortly after the 1989 earthquake, and convincing him that funding the renovation of the cottages into a hostel was a beneficial project for the Conservancy. At that time, mainly due to the loss of funders resulting from the earthquake, the Santa Cruz Hostel Society had decided to give up on the project and had written letters to the city and HI, that's Hosteling International, requesting that they take over the project. HI USA was not interested at the time, but Catherine Byers decided to help on her own initiative and was successful in convincing the Conservancy to grant enough funds to the Hostel Society to get at least one cottage renovated, end quote. So groundbreaking for that first building, that was Captain Dame's house, commenced 30 years ago this month. And then once the hostel started operating the next year, they generated revenues. And so they were able to hire contractors who one by one either refurbished or rebuilt each of the cottages. That process was finally complete in 2010. And the result is what you see today, charming historic cottages within a lovely landscaped city park. So in closing, we owe a debt of gratitude to three women: Ellen Dame, first for having the foresight to buy the property from her husband, next refusing to sell even when she had a most lucrative offer. Back in 1890, she was offered $10,000. That's a lot of money back then, but she said no. And then third, for giving the property to her daughter, Lottie. And though similarly, we owe a debt of gratitude to her sister, Mary Ann Johnson, who gave her adjacent property to her niece, Lottie. And then, of course, we owe a big, big debt of gratitude to Lottie Sly, who gave her property to the city of Santa Cruz. And then on the hostel side, in addition to those names I mentioned, there were numerous other individuals. There were other city officials, city staff, and then, of course, the hostel, the board members, their friends, their supporters, their contributors, and there are contractors, and then finally, their staff, who have worked ever since to keep the hostel open to travelers, just like Lottie and her family first did in 1887.
You are listening to KSKD Santa Cruz. My name is Matilda Rand, host of Exploring Santa Cruz, and my guests are Rick Hyman, whom you just heard, and coming up are Tom Bin and Sarah Tinger. Our topic is the Santa Cruz Hostel and its history. Let's now turn to Tom Bin, who was an early employee of the Santa Cruz Hostel. Many of you know him also for his famous packs that he developed and around which he built his working life. Tom, you heard Rick Hyman share some of his information about the Hostel Society and the summer.
That was awesome. That was cool.
Summer hostel. Yeah, wasn't it great? And the summer hostel at Mission Hill Junior High. Can you share some of your experiences with the early hostel and everything that came later for the year round and everything else?
I came on board, I think in the summer of 1985. I just saw an advertisement for being a staff person at the youth hostel. I thought, well, that sounds fun. So I had a bunch of other jobs at the time that I could work around and work that into. And so I applied and I was hired. And that first summer, we were still at the Mission Hill Junior High School, pretty much as Rick read Peter Petot's description of it. I think that was pretty accurate. And I worked that summer with Tom Gilligan in particular. There were some other employees, but Tom and I came back and worked the next year too and offered to co-manage it. I think a board member had been, quote unquote, managing it, probably Marianne Radler. And so he and I came back and co-managed it. And that was the second summer I worked. And the third summer, I managed it by myself, as I recall. And same with the fourth summer. It became kind of one of my favorite things to do, one of the favorite jobs I've ever had. Really enjoyed meeting all the people from around the world. At that point, mostly Europeans, and made some friends that are still friends today that I've still visit with when they come to the States and still remain in contact with.
So at some point you went to year-round hostel, right? Because you didn't like just doing summer your hostel.
I didn't like doing this just the summer, and I felt like I was, I would look at the numbers and I'd look at the demand before and after. We had a very short season, 8 weeks or 10 weeks or something like that in the summer at the junior high school gym there on Mission Street. And I felt like we could do a year-round hostel. And at the same time, as I recall, something happened with our agreement with the school district. I think they had read in the paper that the Carmelita Cottages was maybe about to come online, which was so far from the truth. Certainly was the buildings had not been renovated and that wasn't happening. But I think they heard that the Carmelita Cottages were happening, so they scheduled other uses for the gymnasium that following summer. So we needed to come up with something anyway. My friend Doug Rand was the facilities person in addition to so many other jobs he did at the Resource Center for Nonviolence on Broadway. They had recently purchased the building next door, and it was a rental. And I started talking to Doug about could the Santa Cruz Hostel Society rent that building and run it as a year-round hostel. He thought that might work and presented it to the board of the Resource Center for Nonviolence. I went back and wrote some budgets that showed that it could work to the Santa Cruz Hostel Society, the nonprofit that Peter Pateau and Peter Canvas and all those other folk that Rick was telling us about were part of. They said, sure, Tom, if you think it can work, you just knock yourself out. So that next summer, at some point, we opened up the building that's still next door to the Resource Center for Nonviolence on Broadway, and we opened it up as a year-round hostel.
And then you became a caretaker at Carmelita Cottages in 1985?
Now that I'm thinking about it, my first year at the youth hostel must have been like 1982.
Was that fun, being caretaker at the Carmelita Cottages?
It was a mixed bag, I'll tell you. They were drafty, leaky, kind of cold places. Security was relatively minimal. Got broken into a couple times. Somebody stole my bicycle from inside my house. It wasn't all fun and games, but it was a beautiful place to live, of course. It had a lot of advantages.
So let's turn to Sarah, because she is the present-day general manager of the hostel. And any feedback what we have heard so far, Sarah?
Oh, it's just always so interesting to hear more of the history. One of the things that he said was about the buildings being drafty and cold. That's really not the case anymore. They're all beautiful and clean and just such great spaces.
Oh, absolutely. I've been back to visit them since. The renovation is, for somebody like me who actually lived in one of those buildings, the renovation has been just mind-bogglingly awesome. I mean, they're substantial, lovely, insulated, warm, cozy buildings now. It's
right.
Amazing what the Hostel Society did.
What's the process?
How do they book?
Yep.
Yeah, so you just book right on our website, santacruzhostel.com. Anything from beds in a shared room, private rooms, or you can even rent full cottages.
And it's year-round?
Year-round, yep. Just go on our website. You can make your booking there. Season is slowing down right now, so it's a great time for staycations and people coming from close by to come and see the cottages and stay 2 blocks away from Main Beach. Such a beautiful spot in our garden.
Now, I understand you was it Thursdays that you do yoga for your travelers on the beach?
Yeah, Thursdays and Fridays at 10:30, from 10:30 to 12:30 right on Main Beach. We have a great volunteer named Vera who comes in and does yoga just for our guests.
And something about a bike shed I heard about. Do people come on bicycles?
Oh, tons of people come on bike, coming up and down the coast, and we have secure storage for your bike and your surfboards, so hopefully there's no worry about things going missing off the property.
Not going into the building like Tom's and getting your bicycle stolen. That's no longer happening.
No, we actually just installed brand new locks, so it's very secure. Everybody has their own codes and can only enter when they have a reservation, so everything is safe and secure, and yeah, people love it.
What kind of feedback do you get from travelers?
Oh, so many positive reviews. If you go on Google and look at our reviews, people just, when they walk into the cottages, you just feel at home. People just love it. It's so beautiful there. We have great volunteers that help us keep the grounds really nice, and we have international volunteers that come in and help us just socialize with guests and keep the rooms really tidy. So, yeah, really a great space.
And when I got there to visit you, to talk to you, I was just sitting out in the front lawn. It's such an inviting place. Can anybody come and sit in the front lawn?
Yeah.
Locals?
Yes, we are still a public park. The land is still owned by the city of Santa Cruz, and we welcome people to come in and hang out and smell the roses and pick some of the passion fruit. Yeah, please come visit.
30 years, huh?
30 years.
Time flies, Tom. 30
Indeed,
years.
yes,
It
yeah.
also means that you and I are 30 years older. But let's not talk about that. Let's talk about the festivities. What can we expect? Because it's this week, is it correct?
Yeah, this Saturday from 1 to 4, we are going to be having some live music by the Joint Chiefs. And we have 4 local artisans coming in to showcase their art. And we have food trucks and cannolis and all sorts of things.
So all people have to bring is their energy and their money, and it'll be a great time.
Exactly. We need a new grill, so that's what we're hoping to fundraise for.
Okay, so there's a fundraiser as well.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Any questions, Tom, for Sarah?
Oh, I'm just so nice to hear your voice again, and it sounds wonderful, everything that you're doing there. It's incredibly exciting.
Yeah, I look forward to meeting you in person sometime.
Yeah, I won't be able to make it down Saturday, but yeah, at some point, it would be great to see you.
Actually, what Rick had suggested, and I talked to Catherine Byers and I talked to Jane Wade, other people very much involved in making this all happen. We would love to do in a couple of months another program, listeners, and where people can chat and probably can call in to talk about their experience with the hostel, because what we do today is just a little slice of history on this radio. So we'll do it again. But first of all, let's review. If you want to contact the Santa Cruz Hostel, call 831-423-8304 or on the web, santacruzhostel.com. And there's a lot of information on your website. I want to see if you have any other final thoughts, Tom.
It was so wonderful to hear Rick's history of the hostel, the old history and the more recent history, some of which I knew and forgot, and some of which I had never known before. So that was amazing. So I want to thank Rick for that, and thank you, Matilda, for putting this together. And since Rick was kind of rattling off all the people who had such a big hand in making it happen, and I think he's spot on all that, I'd like to add Jane Wade's name to that, and also Marianne Radler, who's since passed away, and certainly Peter Cambus, too, and Peter Pateau. So many people involved in it at various times that did so much more than I ever did. So I want to thank all of them for having stuck with it and made it real.
And you didn't mention, what you mentioned to me is that the cottage that you were staying in was called what?
It was called the Clint Eastwood Cottage. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I am not.
Yeah, it was called the Clint Eastwood Cottage because I think the story was there was a scene, whatever the Clint Eastwood movie that was filmed in Santa Cruz, there was a scene deleted from the final movie of him stepping out of the front of that cottage of 317. And when I moved in, there were 2 little X's of masking tape on the floor right in front of the front door that supposedly were his marks to stand there at that position for a camera shot that, again, never made it to the movie. But we called it the Clint Eastwood house anyway.
And unfortunately, the person who stole your bike didn't know that. Otherwise, I bet you that the cottage, East Clintwood, would have made his day, right?
Exactly. Hey, I did get that bicycle back, so.
That's good. That's well. Maybe there was some influence there.
Yeah. Maybe, who knows?
Is there any final thoughts from you?
No, I've only been at the cottages for a year, and I just feel so fortunate to be dropped right in this historic, beautiful space, and I'm so happy to hear more about the history of it.
And we'll do it again in a couple months.
Awesome.
And then I want to thank you both, and of course Rick, who is in New York, Rick Hyman, Tom Bin, and Sarah Tinger, on Exploring Santa Cruz. The contact information again is Santa Cruz Hostel at 831-423-8304 and on the web santacruzhostel.com. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Matilda.
And see
I
you
look
all
forward to seeing everybody at the event on Saturday.
on Saturday, 1 o'clock at the hostel
Yes.
to 4 o'clock. Lots of entertainment. a little fundraiser, food trucks, and lots of activities.
Yep, it's free. Come on over and visit us.